Just how much more will Kenny Pickett be allowed to do in the Steelers offense? We answer that question here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, with Alan Saunders from SteelersNow.com. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hello, welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things on the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find this show on your favorite podcasting apps and on YouTube. Like this video if you enjoyed. Subscribe to this YouTube channel to get all of your daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus content. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day, because we're your team every day. And we're joined by Alan Saunders from SteelersNow.com. He's our man we have on here every week. Alan, it's great to have you on, man. Real quick question here before we get started on this main topic. We know we're talking about Kenny Pickett to lead off here, but of course, everyone knows I stole Kenny Pickett's car, and apparently you got to go to my hearing. How did that go?
Well, you weren't there, so I mean, the hell? Yeah, it was. It seems like there's a defense in the works here. They postponed the hearing for some psychological and drug and alcohol evaluations.
That's
and
me.
So it seems like it seems like we may have some kind of explanation here for this bizarre story. I need to know why you did it, Chris, but I will get that. I'll get that out of you at a later date.
There you go. Well, you can bring me on your show and we can talk about this. And
I think you really were just very curious about how much Kenny Pickett was going to be involved in the offense this year, how much his role was going to expand. And you were like, if I could just get my hands on that playbook, this episode of this podcast would be a lot better.
Fire. That's what I'm talking about right there. So for those who might not remember or know, the guy who stole Kenny Pickett's car last month was named Christopher Carter, and it was a great joke that we are still running with here on the Locked On Steelers podcast and throughout all of Pittsburgh media. So anyways, let's get to this point here, though, because what I do expect out of Kenny Pickett's expanded role in this offense, last year we saw a lot of times where Kenny Pickett was checking down, was not attacking the middle part of the field, things that everyone was saying, Matt Canada, you're stupid, you're ridiculous, why can't you do this part of the offense? And you and I have talked about this a little bit before, but I think that was part of the situation they wanted to deal with the Steelers offense, because they had a rookie quarterback, an offensive line they didn't trust just yet, and an offense that didn't have an identity. And that was a huge part of the problem there. And they had a defense that knew exactly what they wanted to do and how they wanted to win once TJ Watt got back on the field. So I anticipate Kenny Pickett, he's not going to throw like 500 passes or nothing like that this year. He probably not going to throw 400 passes. But I do expect Kenny Pickett to come out and be able to have the control of the offense to take the shots when he wants to and how he wants to in this offense, and get more of a chance to say, hey, we're getting aggressive on this drive when I say so. Maybe not, and that won't happen like every drive in a game, but I think, in critical points in the second quarter, if the Steelers are down by 10 or something, he might be given a little bit of leeway to say like, hey, Mike, Matt, let's switch this up a little bit. Is that something you anticipate this year, or do you think that's still something that it might be a year or two off, or even further off, to give him that kind of those kind of reins for the offense?
I'm not sure we're going to see that. I'm not sure that's really in sort of Matt Canada's ideal offense right now. I don't think they're even really working towards that. What I do think we're going to see is more risk taking from the passing offense, if they earn it. Like, I think the first thing you said there was the most, like, they had an offensive line they didn't trust, and Kenny Pickett turned the ball over. I mean, he had 9 interceptions. I think he fumbled the ball 4 or 5 more times in addition to that. I'm not sure how many he lost, but, like, there were turnovers. And, if you're not going to have an explosive offense, and I think it's fair that even if they tried really hard, they probably were not going to have an explosive offense last year. They have to minimize turnovers. You can't. You can, if you're Patrick Mahomes or Josh Allen or Joe Burrow and you're going to throw for 500 yards, you can turn the ball over some. The Steelers did it when they had Ben Roethlisberger. Some of his most productive passing yard games were the games where he had multiple interceptions. If you go back and look at his stats, 4 or 500 yards and 4 picks like that wasn't an uncommon stat line. they're not going to do that now. And they can't afford the interceptions. And so they were risk averse. And if you think about, the places where there are the easiest completions, the safest throws to make, those are the flats, those are the sidelines. The farther you get from the sideline, the lower the incompletion percentage comes up and the higher the interception rate comes up. And so I just think that this was an offense that did not trust itself to not turn the ball over. I think better protection for Kenny Pickett is the start of that. And I think the natural maturation of him as a reader of defenses and someone that has a stronger and firmer command of the offense will allow them to take some more risks. And then the other thing, a more efficient offense in general running the ball will put them in better down and distance situations to take chances. It is, throwing over the middle on 1st and 10 is difficult, right? Throwing over the middle on play action on 2nd and 1 is easy, right? Like that, but they weren't getting into those down and distance situations where they were able to take more risks. And so I feel like there was a number of factors there, all sort of working towards keeping this offense as basic and as turnover free as possible.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a huge part of what was happening last year, and like an obvious part of their winning. When Kenny Pickett was throwing interceptions, they were losing. When he wasn't throwing interceptions, they were winning. It was kind of that clear. And in fact, one of the few games they lost, and they lost 2 games in the second half of the season. One was the Ravens game when they threw 3 interceptions. And that was when Mitch Trubisky did it. And the other game, Kenny Pickett, they didn't turn the ball over against the Bengals, but that
was the game they scored 30 points, and that's really the one you can kind of circle as saying,
exactly,
hey, the offense did their job this time, even though they lost.
Right, exactly. And I think that's where it's like, if they follow the formula, they'll get the occasional boom in offense, but you can rely upon more them not crushing you and you being able to get the win from other means, than more so that you can rely upon that, because there were only 2 times last year where they scored 28 points or more, and it was the loss to the Bengals and the season finale against the Browns when they scored 28 and beat them 28-14. And I think, again, you're talking about the formula there. That's how they were able to win. They were 1-1 in those games. They were 6-1 in the other 7 in the air, 6, I think maybe 5-1 in the other 7 or other 6 there in that stretch there. But Alan, I think part of this is also going to be, I do think that Kenny Pickett's not going to be given the full reins of this offense. Ben Roethlisberger didn't have the full reins of the offense until maybe the 2010s of his career,
and I think did not ever have it with Matt Canada as the offensive coordinator. I mean,
definitely didn't. Yeah,
I think that was definitely a talking point, and so I don't think we're going to see that from Kenny. I'm also just not sure that is, I think outside of the guys that are at the top tier talent wise, I don't think you're going to, that has become less and less common as the years have gone on, where, it used to be every quarterback called all the plays. And then, we've kind of progressed to the point where really it's just like the very upper level guys have some freedom and everybody else kind of does what they're told.
I hear you on that. I think certain guys get leeway. Troy Polamalu was allowed to do whatever he wanted.
Exactly.
Because he's Troy Polamalu. Not everybody got to do that. And in fact, Ryan Clark even recalls, at times he was just when Troy was doing stuff, we were just that's Troy doing stuff. And I think Minkah Fitzpatrick, not to the full level of Troy Polamalu, but he gets a lot of leeway in the defense in being able to do what he thinks is right for a system, just like James Harrison got to. That's how he got the pick 6 in the Super Bowl. That's how he got I think he got a sack, in the Dolphins playoff game that they won.
Yeah, I mean, there's a variation there, right? This one thing to say, hey, I'm going to go to my second read first because I saw this, right? Where he's not exactly following the script of the play, but Deontay told me he can kill this guy. He's a backup. I know he's not the first read, but I'm just going right to him. Okay, fine. That's reasonable. But to the point where deciding run pass or actually changing out of plays wholesale, that's probably not coming. I don't think. I do think it was a little bit oversaid, the hot route debate last year where Pat Freiermuth said they didn't have them, and they very clearly do have them. They just don't have what they had from Ben Roethlisberger, where he would actually have a signal to change each receiver's route and say, hey, I want you to do this, and hey, I want you to do that. And like Kenny Pickett is not getting that level of responsibility at the line. If there's a blitz, someone needs to be aware of that and break their route off and give him a hot option. It's not like they're out there without hot reads. It's just in a different way where someone else has that pre-snap responsibility to say, oh, this guy's blitzing, I got to break this off and be available. And I think that makes a lot of sense to me as an offense that was coming out of the college ranks, because that's a lot of responsibility to give one person. I think that might be an adjustment that we see from Matt Canada. If Kenny Pickett earns that level of trust, will he go along with that? I don't know. We'll see. But we're ways away from that right now, for sure.
I agree. We're ways away from that, but I want to talk about other players who might get an expanded role and maybe some of those younger players on the roster. We'll talk about that here in a minute on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm Chris Carter, your host here with Alan Saunders. But before we do that, I want to talk to you guys about our great sponsors at FanDuel Sportsbook, the #1 sportsbook in America. Right now with Major League Baseball in full swing, there's no better place to get in on the action than FanDuel, America's #1 sportsbook. Right now, FanDuel is giving new customers a no-sweat first bet up to $1,000 back in bonus bets that you get if your first bet doesn't hit when you sign up for FanDuel. And to sign up for that deal, go to FanDuel.com/lockedon. You'll sign up today and you can claim your no sweat first bet, all in an app that's safe, secure, and super easy to use. Don't miss your shot at a no sweat first bet up to $1,000 when you join FanDuel today by going to FanDuel.com/lockedon to sign up. Make every moment more with FanDuel, an official partner of Major League Baseball. Major League Baseball trademarks used with permission. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. Alan, let's flip to Kenny Pickett's colleagues on the offense and who gets to see an expanded role. And you and I talked a little bit more. One obvious answer that we have up on the screen here, if you're watching on YouTube, is Calvin Austin, because he'll get a role. And like that'll be
any role is an expanded role.
Right. And I don't know if you remember, but like around maybe like week 6, whatever it was, around the time when they had to declare if Calvin Austin was coming back or not. And people were just like, well, why won't they let him play? This is so stupid. And it's like, because he's hurt. And that was like a whole thing. And I'm like, why are we debating this? We think that the Steelers do not want a fast receiver that they just drafted.
He's still not healthy, by the way. Still not 100%. People were flipping out in week 8 last year because he wasn't playing. Meanwhile, he's like still hurt June. Absurd. And also he's going to play this year and he's going to get like 5 touches a game. And that's fine. I think it'll be a good role for him, but it's not going to be a big role. It will be an expanded role. Some other guys I think on offense that could do more maybe than we've seen in the past. I think I expect to see some year 2 growth from Connor Hayward. I think he really showed something down the stretch. If you think about where he started his season, I actually remember talking to him after that opening week. He got 1 snap on offense in an overtime game. 1 snap. And I was like, 1? Like, how do you get 1 snap? And then, that Browns game, he's sort of the key cog on sort of some of those third downs on that final drive of the last, I think you saw him make a big progression from the beginning of his rookie year to the end of the year. I expect to see more out of him going forward. Anthony McFarland, I think, is, he's a guy who was on the practice squad all year last year. Right now, I think he's pretty clearly on the 53, and given his special teams ability, will probably have a helmet on game days, and so he may have a role. But there's, the thing about this offense is the pieces are so young that it's like they don't have like guys coming up behind them because they're all babies. It's a young group, and so there aren't a lot of candidates when we're talking about guys that are gonna have expanded role. George Pickens, I mean, I think we could talk about that too.
Sure.
Like Frisman Jackson's quotes from minicamp, I thought were pretty revealing as to how much further they think that George Pickens can go from where he was last year, which was already pretty impressive for a 2nd-round pick in a rookie year.
I agree. I mean, he was definitely impressive, and that's part of what the reason I'm asking this question across the board on offense, because of that. I saw a report about how Nick Chubb is expected to have a much different kind of role in the Browns game, including the receiving game, and how they're going to use him with Deshaun Watson. Could we expect to see something similar like that for Najee Harris? Whereas Najee has gotten all the touches before. Not that he's going to get more touches than he did his rookie year, but could we see him line up in more diverse areas? Line up and be used as an actual receiving back a little bit more, because that was a strength that we were talking about as a potential for him when he was coming out of Alabama.
I just think in general we're going to see a lot more of that kind of thing from this offense in terms of moving guys around. I think so much of what we saw last year was the fear of the offensive line not being able to keep Kenny clean. And so I think there was a lot of basic that came out of that, where like a lot of Pat Freiermuth with his hand on the ground next to a tackle, a lot of Najee Harris right next to Kenny Pickett or right behind Kenny Pickett, so that they could feel safe if there was a big blitz. I think with the improvement to the offensive line, I think we'll be able to see a little bit more creativity about where guys line up on offense, a little bit more empty, a little bit more splitting guys out wide. Maybe it's not necessarily a 5 receiver package, but you might see Najee Harris, Darnell Washington, and George Pickens all over there out on the flank together, as opposed to in their sort of traditional places to line up. I think that's something that has been a part of Matt Canada's offenses in the past that we did not see last year. I remember, the way he lined guys up at Pitt, there would always be wide receivers in the backfield, wide receivers looking like a tight end, tackle eligibles, fullbacks split out wide, and we didn't see hardly any of that stuff. We saw it in some running situations. We saw very little of that stuff to this point in passing situations, and I think most of that is just a lack of faith of the offensive line to keep things clean if they don't have help sort of readily available to them. So, yeah, I think there's definitely an opportunity to do some more of that.
I agree with you there. I also think you talked a little bit about Pat Freiermuth there. Does his role as a receiving tight end expand more because they got Darnell Washington, they kept Zach Gentry, they still have Connor Hayward. They have 3 tight ends that I'm pretty sure they can feel comfortable with, like saying, "Hey, your job on this play, block that guy. Just don't let him go. Don't worry about running around unless it's like a scramble drill and Kenny needs your help. But your main job is to help Kenny Pickett stay clean or, do this." And Pat Freiermuth, you're going to be out in the huddle and teams are going to say, "Oh, they're coming out in 12 personnel. So maybe we come out a little bit heavier." But all of a sudden, Pat Freiermuth is lining up on the outside while Deontay Johnson's in the slot. And everyone's like, "What the heck is going on?" I think there's not a guarantee this is going to happen because, again, Matt Canada is the offensive coordinator. But that's where Matt Canada, if he wants to get extra creative, it's finding expanded roles for some of the players that I think might be taken for granted here when we think about what could be different about this team, because they've been important to this team the last 2-3 seasons. And that's, I think, Najee Harris, Pat Freiermuth, they came in the same time, first and second round picks of the 2021 draft. I think that's a huge part of what we're dealing with here.
Yeah, I think there's a lot of meat on the bone there in terms of not just things that are possible to do, but like that sort of alignment. Like, okay, when we talked about Kenny, like, we were talking about some things that we have not seen from Matt Canada, right? So, like, the idea of that happening, like, there's a lot of factors that would have to happen, I think, to get us there. But with this, it's stuff that Canada has done in the past, but just didn't do last year. And so I think that's really a sign that, like, oh, if they just get a little bit more pass protection, get a little bit more comfortable with guys like Darnell Washington involved, I think that really opens up the playbook to do a lot more different things in the passing game. It was really a very basic passing offense last year. It obviously limited all of the guys in it. And so I think there's definitely a lot more meat on the bone there. If you go back and look at some of the Matt Canada stuff from NC State or from Pitt, like, you will see the things that we're talking about in this offense. It is not like, go look at how we used Jalen Samuels at NC State, for example. Like, that's a really good one. Whereas a guy who literally lined up at 5 or 6 different positions on the offense, a tailback, a fullback, an H-back, a tight end, all the way out a wide receiver, a slot guy. Like, you could see guys like Najee Harris and Calvin Austin and Pat Freiermuth have that ability to put them really wherever you want to. I think it's mostly just been about the trust in the rest of the offense to be able to deal with that. It's been holding them back.
I hear you. That's a big thing there. Well, I want to talk about the defensive side of the ball though too, and who else gets who gets an expanded role there, and why it's two guys that are also in their second year with the Steelers, but in different ways, who could be a big key there. We'll talk about that here and more on the Locked On Steelers podcast. Chris Carter with Alan Saunders. We'll be right back. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, here with Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. Alan, let's flip to the defense. We talked a lot of offense with expanded roles and what we expect to see out of them, and naturally so. Kenny Pickett's a second-year quarterback. They found their identity. Najee Harris even talked about that during mini camp, saying that, hey, we know who we are now. But the defense kind of knows who they are. Now, there's new players who have to figure out their way in the defense, and Patrick Peterson and guys like that. Landon Roberts, Cole Holcomb, they're all going to be figuring out how they fit into the defense, Keanu Neal as well. But guys who have been here, guys who have been in Pittsburgh, who we've seen, who could take a biggest step. You and I talked about off the air before the show, DeMarvin Leal and Damontae Kazee. Now, Kazee, bit different here because he's a veteran. He's coming from another team, or he was on the team last year, was hurt for half the season, then appeared in the middle part of the season, and I think was a very important part to the improvement of the defense as the year went on with his ball skills, his ability to play off ball or a deeper safety role to let Minkah Fitzpatrick roll around a bit. And his abilities to make plays on the football where Terrell Edmunds didn't have that, and his veteran experience became an asset. DeMarvin Leal also missed a good chunk of the season, but as a rookie, he was kind of figuring out his own on the defensive line, and I think he became a good problem for the Steelers to give offensive lines because of where he could line up inside, outside, linebacker. Even talked about. He's like, I never even did that at Texas A&M, and he was just like, I think his role last year was kind of figuring out where he fit best for the Steelers. And now it's going to be about, I think, a similar thing here as a guy coming off the bench. Kazee's a starter here, but Saunders, who do you think between those two or anyone else on the Steelers defense has the biggest increase of a role in the Steelers' success on defense from last year?
I really like DeMarvin Leal, and I think he's going to be important, and we can talk about him more. But I think, to me, the biggest factor here and the biggest change is Damontae Kazee taking on the bulk of that strong safety role. And it really goes back to, go back to the decision to draft Terrell Edmunds and why that decision kind of ended up as a failure, despite, I think, people around Pittsburgh generally sort of underrating his play. Like, I don't think Terrell Edmunds was a bad safety. I think he ended up being a bad pick because Terrell Edmunds was just not capable of doing all of the different things that the Steelers were asking out of that position. He just did not have the coverage skills to do the things that they needed that person to do. That doesn't mean that he was bad at what he was, what he could do. But he was a box safety in a pass happy league. And he was out of place a lot of times. And I think a lot of the fans' frustration with Terrell Edmunds sort of came from seeing 34 like flailing and unable to keep up with a guy that he probably should have never been asked to cover in the first place. And so what they've done with this strong safety role is sort of acknowledge that they do not have someone that can do everything that they want from a strong safety. And now there are two guys that are going to fill that role. One is, much more heavily slanted towards coverage. The other much more heavily slanted towards run stopping in Kazee and Neal. But the thing about Damontae Kazee is not only is he a really good safety and a really good cover safety in his own right and an elite ball hawk. If you look at his career numbers, even last year, he had 2 picks in 9 games. You'll take that rate any day for a guy that didn't even play that much, right? But it's not just about him. It's about what it allows them to do with Minkah Fitzpatrick. If we think back to those we talked about Troy Polamalu earlier and that freedom to freelance and do different things. It's hard to do that when Minkah's partner at safety wasn't capable of doing all the same things that Minkah could, right? But now from a coverage standpoint, Kazee is nearly Minkah Fitzpatrick's equal in terms of his just sort of turn and run coverage ability. And so putting the two of them together, I think, gives the Steelers so many more things they can do with Minkah. They want to blitz him. They want to use him as a robber. They want to buzz him down into the flat. They want to put him up and bump and run on a slot guy. They can do so many more different things with Minkah Fitzpatrick because of having Damontae Kazee back there that can perform all of those coverage roles. It's almost like they're sort of flipping the safety roles when they do that, where Minkah is actually going to kind of become what we would have called a strong safety before, and Kazee is going to be the freer safety, the more coverage-based guy. And I think that just fits Minkah's skill set. It allows him to make a much bigger impact on the defense. And so I like DeMarvin Leal. We can talk about him. We can talk about Mark Robinson. But for me, this is a huge deal for fixing what has been a big problem with the Steelers defense for quite some time. And the idea of Minkah Fitzpatrick's play over the last few years suddenly freed up with even more playmaking ability, that's sort of tantalizing to think about.
I think so. Yeah, I agree. It's the freedom that he offers Minkah Fitzpatrick to move about, because you're right. Minkah Fitzpatrick often just had to be the guy in the middle part of it. Just play robber, take away the middle part of the field. And it worked. I mean, he still is up there in the most interceptions over the past 4 years in the NFL. He's
playing 12 yards off the ball.
Right.
Yeah.
That's impressive for what he's been able to do. But now you're right. Now Kazee gives you the flexibility of he can move that. And I also think on top of just allowing to be in more places, it allows Terrell Austin more opportunities to draw up confusion points for quarterbacks, because when you can disguise more, because more guys are versatile, that's the key to today's NFL. I think that's the key to being a great defensive coordinator, is when you have those pieces, finding ways to disguise them more. And if you're sitting there before a game and you're studying and you're sitting there okay, well, we're not too scared of Terrell Edmunds playing the single deep coverage safety here. So if he does drop back there, we're just going right at him. If Minkah drops back there, we'll figure we adjust the play and we go off of that. But if you sit there and you say, you know what, both of these guys are a problem. If they drop back in the middle part of the field, we have to be aware of what each of them is going to do and what they might do underneath. And I think that extra pack of strengths that you add to your defense, it brings more there. And also, talking about Keanu Neal, I think he kind of fills a little bit of the Terrell Edmunds, a bit shorter. And I think that, it might not be the same as far as covering tight ends for Terrell Edmunds was able to help with the Steelers. But I think that he's going to be an asset that it also helps expand Minkah Fitzpatrick's role. But let's talk about DeMarvin Leal a little bit here, because you brought him up, and I like him too. I said going into last training camp, I thought he was going to be one of the biggest problems that the Steelers had on the defensive line. He got hurt early on, and that didn't allow him to kind of have the full season impact. But we saw once he was in there and he was starting to get his feet under him that he was figuring things out. And I just really think that with the defensive lineup that they have right now, you think of a front four, because they kind of just use a front four. I know 3-4 is kind of the thing that they do on a base set, but bases nowadays is shotgun versus nickel. But your front four is Hayward, Ogunjobi, Watt, Highsmith. And if you can bring out DeMarvin Leal and Keanu Benton as part of that second group of four, and Leal maybe even being one of the edge options next to Marcus Golden, while you throw in maybe a Braden Fehoko or an Armon Watts or a Montrevious Adams or whoever in the middle along with Keanu Benton, I think you give yourself a ton of flexibility and options to confuse offensive lines. That's another thing, is that if defensive linemen are able to move around more, it forces the offensive line to communicate and say, wait a minute, we practice for this guy to be here, not that guy to be here, and we have to and it gives you kind of a different look as far as preparations and what I have to study as an offensive lineman versus one player versus maybe 3 or 4 different players you have to get ready for.
Yeah, and I think the other thing that's very, it's not just the fact that you're bringing in a second guy, or, a guy off the bench, who can fill a role. It's that Cam Hayward is 34 years old. And if you're talking about maximizing what you're getting out of a player that age and potentially extending his career, I think the ability to have a guy that can spell him is going to be key. He played 955 snaps in 2021. In 2022, he was healthy, played and started all 17 games. He only played 801. Okay. And this is without TJ Watt available to this defense. Mm-hmm. So, we need to adjust our expectations for what a 34-year-old is capable of. And that is going to include needing somebody that can be not just a space taker. And I think a lot of those other guys you mentioned can go like they all, some of them have NFL experience. The ones that don't certainly have talent. But I think all the other guys you mentioned of those potential interior guys, Benton and Watson, Fehoko and Isaiah Loudermilk and Amani Adams. And like, to me, those guys are space takers. I think DeMarvin Leal has a different gear, a different level of athleticism that makes him more of a problem for offenses. And he is not just another guy that's in there. He is somebody that teams have to worry about. And if you can put him on the same side as a TJ Watt or as an Alex Highsmith, or you bump him out and you bring in a Larry or a Cam on that same side, whether he's spelling the interior guys or the exterior guys, I just think he makes for a much more dangerous defense. And so that's important too. I don't think it's as important as what Kazee is going to do for the secondary, but it's big. And I think we would be remiss if we got to this point without talking about the fact that, hey, TJ Watt's going to have a bigger role this year. Fingers crossed, right? I mean, that's kind of an important guy. And one of the things we talked about on the Final Word on Channel 11 on Sunday is the Steelers being underrated. And it's like, yeah, I just don't see how you can see a team that was missing its best player and had a rookie quarterback, and now they've fixed their offensive line and they're going to get TJ back, and Kenny's going to be a full-time starter from day one, and somehow Vegas thinks they're going to be worse. Like, you can't sell me on that. I'm never going to believe it. It's just not going to happen. And that number 90, he's okay.
Yeah, he's all right. He brings a little bit to the game. But I mean, again, that was the whole point of my Monday show. We came out of that. I talked about our FanDuel odds here, and I just think it's an easy bet to say 8.5 is the over-under of wins this year. I will take the over easily. And a few fans even brought it up in the YouTube comments section of that episode. They're like, Chris, I've been betting on that for 5 years. I never miss with the Steelers projections. It's just like Vegas puts them low, we just go above that, and they're gonna hit that there. And granted, that doesn't make meaning that the Steelers are perfect or that they've done everything that they want to. There's certain things that we wish they could have done the last few seasons, but I think it's a representation of how they've been above the line when it comes to what people expect of them from the roster that they've had over the past few years. And if they do see these improvements, if these roles do expand, like Kenny Pickett getting more of the offense, more of these guys on offense getting chances to kind of expand what they do, the defense giving their best players more flexibility to be the best players without having to worry about the different spots on the roster. All those things add to a better Steelers team that I think is a bigger threat all season long, and even in the playoffs, where I think that they will be at the end of the season. He's Alan Saunders of SteelersNow.com. I'm Chris Carter, host of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Alan, thanks so much for joining us as always. Let people know they can find you, follow you, and get more of your work.
At @Saunders_PGH on Twitter, at PGH Steelers Now is the site's Twitter, SteelersNow.com. Check it out. All the work from me, from Nick, from the whole team there at SteelersNow.com. We're cruising through our All 90 series where we're talking about every player on the roster this offseason. So you got a full story on James Pierre, and you got a full story on, Allen Robinson. You got a full story on some guy you never heard of before. So go check it out because you will, if you read all 90 of those by the time the Steelers get ready to take the field at St. Vincent College training camp, you are going to be super well, and you'll be telling all your friends about, oh yeah, that's Darius Hagan's, man. He's a running back from an HBCU, and that's how you sound smart with your friends. Read SteelersNow.com.
Absolutely. Get all the knowledge there at SteelersNow.com. Thanks again, Alan, for joining us here in the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter. Follow me on Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. Read my work at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette by going to post-gazette.com, where I cover all things Pitt football, basketball, and Pitt athletics. You can also find me on the Locked On Steelers podcast Monday through Friday right here on the Locked On Podcast Network. And also, if you want to help out, we are still raising money for the Cystic Fibrosis Foundation. Just if you use the link or the QR code that's currently on your screen or in the description description of this podcast. You can donate to the campaign that we have going right now. And if you donate at least $10 or more, when you call 412-223-6644 and leave a question for us to be answered, be sure to leave your name, where you're from, and keep your question under a minute. We will shoot you to the front of the line. Your question will at least get answered within the week, probably get answered right away if we can get it on the show. Thanks again to all those who so far who have donated. I'm Chris Carter. He's Alan Saunders. Thanks again, everybody. Back Wednesday with more on your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.